The clink of silverware against china filled the dining room, blending with the soft hum of conversation and the scent of Mom's glazed ham. Lilies stood tall in the center of the table, their perfume mixing with the tang of Dad's bourbon cocktails. Easter at my parents' house had always been more performance than gathering, a time for Brennan to polish his resume in front of a captive audience. He leaned back in his chair, designer watch catching the chandelier's glow. Tech Fusion just promoted me to senior manager in enterprise solutions, he announced, pausing long enough for the relatives to murmur their approval. It's a tough industry. Not everyone can handle a real career in tech. His eyes slid across the table until they locked on mine. The comment hung there, obvious enough that even Aunt Clara lowered her fork. A few chuckles broke the silence, the kind that pretended to be harmless but landed sharp. Heat climbed my neck, but I kept my face steady, fingers tightening around my napkin. I'd been through this ritual before Brennan's victory laps, my muted role as the family's creative experiment. I looked down at the plate, at the honey-glazed carrots that suddenly tasted bitter. Around me, the conversation picked up again, people carefully steering away from me as if silence were safer. Mom beamed at Brennan. Dad poured him more wine. I sat still, listening to the rhythm of praise I'd memorized over the years. At the far end, Grandpa Ed cleared his throat softly. He hadn't spoken much all evening, but I saw the glint of his old Hamilton watch as he checked the time. His expression was unreadable, patient in a way that made me wonder if he knew more than he let on. The moment passed, and Brennan resumed holding court. I stayed quiet, though the silence no longer felt like surrender. It felt like waiting. Brennan and I grew up under the same roof, yet the paths laid out for us couldn't have been more different. He was the Golden Boy Honor Roll, Robotics Club, Stanford acceptance letter pinned proudly on the refrigerator. I remember Dad clapping him on the back the day his internship in Palo Alto was confirmed, as if the family's future had been secured in one email. My road looked less polished. I worked the cash register at a retail store in Alhambra by day, and at night I hunched over a beat-up laptop, teaching myself to code with online tutorials and trial and error. Where Brennan had professors and mentors, I had error messages and black coffee. The only applause I ever heard was the quiet ping when my script finally ran without crashing. At family dinners, Mom's favorite refrain was, "Your brother's degree will open every door. You should think about going back to school. Thalia, a real degree gives stability." She meant well, but each word pressed down like a weight. Dad, never eager for conflict, would clear his throat and change the subject, asking if anyone wanted more potatoes. I learned to swallow my explanations and keep my progress tucked away like a secret notebook. Even Grandpa Ed once echoed the chorus. A safe job, Thalia, that's what you want. But years later, when he visited my first office, a windowless room above a Koreatown laundromat, something shifted. He stood in the doorway, listening as I explained how I'd landed my first client, a local food distributor who needed better supply tracking. The space smelled of detergent from below, and my desk was a door balanced on cinder blocks. But Grandpa nodded slowly, taking it all in. From then on, he asked sharper questions. Not about degrees or titles, but about contracts, uptime, and cash flow. It was the first time I felt truly seen. And that memory returned to me now as I watched him check his watch at the Easter table, silent but steady, while Brennan held the room with his polished words. The first version of Supply Stream lived in a drafty loft south of Market Street. The paint peeled near the windows, and the old freight elevator rattled each time it carried clients upstairs. But I didn't care. I had a desk, a whiteboard, and a product that if it worked could save mid-sized companies from drowning in chaotic spreadsheets. Our first client was a regional food distributor that delivered to restaurants across California. Their inventory records were a mess. Drivers were always behind, and orders kept slipping through the cracks. I worked through nights rewriting code, chasing bugs until the sun came up. When their system finally stabilized under our platform, they sent me a thank you note hand-signed by the owner. That piece of paper meant more to me than any degree. The second client was bigger, a national apparel chain that had outgrown its legacy software. Winning that contract wasn't luck, it was grit. I spent weeks pitching, revising, and proving we could scale. When they signed, I knew SupplyStream wasn't just surviving, it was building momentum. It was around then that Priya joined me, sharp, disciplined, and endlessly patient. She turned my scattered processes into an actual company. She brought in compliance audits, structured hiring, and financial discipline. Together, we navigated investor meetings, not by selling dreams, but by showing data uptime percentages, order accuracy, cost savings for clients. Funding came in because the numbers spoke for themselves. Within a few years, we had offices in 3 countries and over 200 employees. Our platform quietly powered supply chains for companies that most families recognized from grocery store shelves and shopping malls. Yet, back home, I stayed quiet at dinner tables, letting Brennan's voice fill the air while mine remained still. The only one who asked for updates was Grandpa Ed. He'd sit with me at his kitchen table in Altadena, pouring cinnamon tea into chipped mugs, and listen as I explained margins, integration challenges, or client onboarding. He didn't always understand every acronym, but he listened harder than anyone else. And as Brennan's stories grew louder, Grandpa's quiet faith became the anchor I leaned on. Brennan's world looked polished on the surface glass conference rooms in North San Jose, catered lunches, and the Tech Fusion logo stamped proudly on every slide deck. But beneath that shine, his division was struggling. Enterprise Solutions, the unit he managed, had been flat for quarters. Contracts weren't renewing. New deals lagged, and a quiet whisper about restructuring made its way through the office halls. He heard the rumors and side conversations, 2 engineers lingering near the coffee machine, a VP's assistant lowering her voice as she stepped into an elevator. Brennan smiled wider when he walked past, but inside, each word landed heavy. He knew what happened to managers when the numbers slipped. He'd seen one escorted out 2 years earlier, his badge disabled before he reached the parking lot. So Brennan doubled down on the mask. He filled his presentations with acronyms and graphs that trended upward even when reality didn't. He dressed sharper, traded his old sedan for a Tesla, and made sure everyone noticed the new watch on his wrist. The image mattered. If people believed he was indispensable, maybe the numbers wouldn't matter as much. At home, that same mask hardened into arrogance. Family dinners became his stage. He never said my name without attaching some diminutive Thalia's little project, or her side hobby. He convinced himself he was protecting his position by making me look smaller, as though minimizing my work could inflate his. I recognized the pattern. His smugness wasn't just pride, it was armor. He was terrified of being revealed as ordinary, of losing the spotlight that had defined him since childhood. Still, knowing that didn't dull the sting when his laughter cut across a table and made my efforts invisible. Brennan had built his entire identity on being the successful one, the standard bearer of the family. But now, with his division teetering and rumors swirling, the very persona that shielded him began to betray him. A mask meant to project confidence had turned into a cage he couldn't step out of. And while he clung to that cage, I was quietly preparing for the move that would change everything. The news came to us quietly, buried in an industry report that Priya flagged one morning. Tech Fusion was exploring strategic options for its Enterprise Solutions division. On paper, it was routine corporate speak, but we both understood what it meant. The unit was underperforming. The board wanted to shed the weight. For weeks, I'd forced myself not to think about Brennan's place inside that division. But when Priya slid the report across the table in our Soma office, I couldn't ignore it. "We're perfectly positioned," she said, tapping the line that hinted at restructuring. "Our platform overlaps with half their contracts. If they spin it off, we can absorb and scale." I nodded, heart pounding. It made perfect sense. Our supply chain software had grown lean and efficient while theirs had bloated into legacy systems. Still, I hesitated. "You know what everyone will say if we buy this division. They'll think it's about Brennan." Priya's eyes didn't waver. "Then let them. Business is business. You built a company to solve problems. This is one of them. We began sketching out an offer, retain the engineers, restructure leadership, merge their code base with ours. Priya handled the financial models while I mapped the integration plan. Meetings with bankers followed, then late-night calls with lawyers who assured us the carve-out was feasible. At night, I drove down to Grandpa's house in Altadena, where cinnamon tea waited on the table. He insisted on role-playing the negotiations, leaning across from me with his machinist's hands folded like a board member. They'll push you on valuation. He warned, stay calm. Numbers don't sweat. When I confessed my fear that this looked like a sibling rivalry dressed up as strategy, he shook his head. A good deal stands on its own legs. If it happens to rattle your brother, that's not your fault. Don't confuse timing with motive. His words steadied me, but a knot still sat in my chest. Every signature we collected, every draft that circled back from legal, carried the weight of family ties I couldn't completely untangle. By the time due diligence was nearly complete, I realized this wasn't just a transaction. It was a turning point, one I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. And when the closing date landed just before Easter weekend, the collision course with Brennan became impossible to ignore. The final signatures went down on a rainy Friday afternoon in San Francisco. Papers slid across the polished table, pens clicked, and with each signature, the future shifted. Priya and I exchanged a glance relief mixed with disbelief. It was done. SupplyStream now owned TechFusion's Enterprise Solutions division. The press embargo was set for Sunday at 6 p.m. sharp. Until then, silence. Our employees would be briefed Monday morning before the story hit the wires. The bankers and lawyers congratulated us in their practiced tones. But beneath the routine, I felt the thrum of something larger. This wasn't just another deal. It was the one that would collide with my family in ways no spreadsheet could model. That evening, I drove to Altadena. Grandpa was waiting at his kitchen table with 2 mugs of cinnamon tea, steam curling into the air. I laid the paperwork in front of him. He read slowly, lips moving as he traced the lines. When he finished, he tapped his Hamilton wristwatch with a gnarled finger. Timing is everything, he said. Don't speak too soon. Let the truth arrive when the clock says it's ready. I trusted him more than anyone. He promised he wouldn't breathe a word until the moment came. Still, the weight of secrecy pressed on me. I wasn't just carrying a business acquisition. I was carrying the knowledge that my brother's world was about to tilt. The next 2 days crawled. I checked the clock constantly, rehearsing answers in my head. If Brennan mocked me again at Easter, if Mom dismissed my work, if Dad poured him wine first, I would have to swallow it all, knowing what lay only hours ahead. When Sunday afternoon came, I loaded the car with a bottle of wine and the lemon tart Mom liked. Driving south along the 5, I watched the road unspool under a hazy spring sky. My chest felt tight, as though each mile carried me closer to an explosion no one else could see. By the time I turned onto the familiar tree-lined street in South Pasadena, the hour hand was inching toward 6, and Grandpa's words echoed in my mind. Brennan was in full stride, his voice carrying above the clink of cutlery and the hum of small talk. He gestured with his wine glass, describing the scope of his strategic leadership, the way he had to manage teams under pressure, how only a certain kind of mind could survive in enterprise tech. Relatives nodded along, some clearly lost in the jargon but too polite to admit it. I sat quietly, forcing a smile, my fork moving food around my plate while the second hand of Grandpa's Hamilton watch ticked in my peripheral vision. At 5:59, I felt my chest tighten. By 6:00, Grandpa cleared his throat, a soft sound that drew the table's attention more effectively than Brennan's entire performance. "Brennan," he asked, his tone casual. "Which division did you say you worked in again, Enterprise Solutions?" Brennan replied, his shoulders squaring with pride. "We're basically the backbone of TechFusion's revenue stream." Grandpa nodded once, then turned his gaze toward me. His eyes were sharp, unblinking. "Thalia, Is that why your company just acquired his—" The room froze. Aunt Clara's spoon slipped, clattering against her plate. Mom's smile faltered. Even the air seemed to pause, thick with confusion. Brennan's head jerked toward me, then down to his phone. His thumb flew across the screen, eyes scanning frantically until they stopped. His face drained of color. The headline glared back at him. Supply Stream finalizes acquisition of Tech Fusion's Enterprise Solutions division. My name was beneath it. Every pair of eyes shifted to me. I straightened in my chair, heart steady, and spoke clearly. Yes. We closed the deal Friday. We'll keep most of the engineers, but the division needed restructuring. Integration begins this week. For the first time, no one interrupted. I described our platform, our client base, the scale we had built facts I had carried quietly for years. Dad set his glass down slowly. Mom's lips parted as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Brennan shoved his chair back, muttered something about needing air, and left the table before dessert. The sound of his footsteps faded down the hall. Grandpa leaned back, folding his hands in his lap, the faintest smile crossing his face as the table filled with stunned silence that, for once, felt like recognition. Monday morning, the Soma office buzzed with a different kind of energy. The acquisition had gone public overnight, and our inboxes were overflowing with questions. Calendars packed with transition meetings. I arrived early, coffee in hand, to find Brennan already waiting outside my office door. His tie was loose. His hair a little unkempt gone was the polished figure who had lectured at Easter. He stood when I approached, shifting awkwardly. I had no idea, he said quietly. All this time, I thought you were just playing at it. I unlocked the door, set my bag down, and gestured for him to sit. It wasn't play, Brennan. It never was. We talked for a long while. I told him his technical record was strong, that I'd read through his projects and respected his engineering work, but his management style, layers of jargon, posturing, fear-driven decisions had to change. If he wanted to stay, he would be treated like anyone else, a 30-day assessment, reporting to Priya, with deliverables set in writing. His title didn't shield him, performance would. He nodded slowly, the words sinking in. For the first time, he didn't argue. He just listened. That afternoon, my phone rang. Dad's voice was softer than usual. I owe you an apology, he said. We should have supported you the way we did Brennan. I should have tried harder. His words caught me off guard, not because I needed them, but because he finally chose to say them. Later. Mom called too, not with excuses, but with questions about how Supply Stream worked. Her voice carrying genuine curiosity. By evening, I sat in my office, watching the city lights flicker on across the bay. The weight I'd carried for years, the need to prove myself, to be heard, felt lighter. I no longer needed validation from them. The work itself was proof enough. And as the first joint team meeting loomed, I understood that the real challenge wasn't winning recognition. It was leading well now that all eyes were finally on me. Weeks slipped into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first. Brennan came into the office each morning without his usual bravado, slipping into a desk beside Jonah, one of our senior engineers. At first, he struggled. His code reviews came back with red marks. His instinct to manage rather than collaborate rubbed the team the wrong way. But slowly, I watched something shift. He stayed later, fixing bugs himself, asking Jonah for feedback instead of hiding behind jargon. For the first time in years, he was learning instead of performing. At our next family dinner, the air was different. Brennan didn't arrive with a speech rehearsed. He asked questions instead. When I mentioned a new client in passing, Mom leaned forward, eager to understand rather than dismiss. Dad poured drinks evenly, no longer reaching for Brennan's glass first. The hierarchy that had once defined us seemed to be loosening its grip. Grandpa Ed sat quietly through most of the meal, then spoke in his gravelly voice. Thalia, he said, looking at me with a hint of shame. I once told you to get a safe job. I was wrong. Took me too long to see it, but I see it now. His words hung in the air, heavier than Brennan's old boasts. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Growth, I realized, wasn't limited by age. Respect was being rebuilt, brick by careful brick, not through headlines or press releases, but through the small ways we spoke to each other, the silences we no longer filled with dismissive laughter. The true victory wasn't that my company's name was printed in TechCrunch. It was that I could finally sit at the table without shrinking. And as I looked around at faces that were learning to see me clearly, I knew the work of rebuilding was only just beginning.